Alright guys, welcome to another video lesson. Today we are going to talk about colonial society and the First Great Awakening. Specifically, we're going to talk about the society around slavery and about what brought the colonies together and what also separated them, or divided them. So we'll get into all that. Do now, normal stuff, prepare your notes page, um, you know, present, mark present. If you were absent and you're watching this video later, make sure you let me know on Teams and identify major Enlightenment thinkers and the Americans they influenced. So keep those in mind from yesterday. Let's get into it though. So, first, our objective, we're going to explain the different societies and practices in the British colonial regions. And again, I say societies, I don't necessarily mean like the cultures. We talked about cultures already. We're going to talk about slavery, and we're going to talk about the things that divided and separated them, and we're going to talk about the First Great Awakening. Terms, I'm not going to get into them, but there they are. And the big brain question of the day, identify positive and negative factors of the British colonies up to 1754. So just keep that in mind as we're finishing up Unit 2. So, title we already covered. Objective we already covered. Let's get into slavery in the colonies. This will be our first header here. Key point 1. All, and I mean all, of the British colonies participated in varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade. So some colonies participated more than others. Very specific colonies like Pennsylvania didn't want to participate at all, but they did. Certain members of the colony did. Quakers as a group of people did not at all. Right, those are the first abolitionists, but they were not. There is no one colony that's completely controlled by Quakers, even though a lot of them live in certain ones. So let's talk about distribution of slaves in the area. If you need this slide, go ahead and pause here because we're moving on. So, New England farms used relatively few enslaved laborers. In fact, almost none. There were very few in the New England regions, and same for the middle regions, really. However, southern coastal plantations held a lot of slaves. It's just the nature of the area, as rough as that may be. Now, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, you got to remember that most of the slaves in the Atlantic slave trade found their way to the British West Indies, these little Caribbean islands down here below. This is where most African slaves through the Atlantic slave trade went on. When we talk about slavery more, we'll talk about the American slave trade and how this kind of stays around even after this goes away. But during this time period, right, during this era, most end up here. It's just something to keep in mind. And we're going to really quickly talk about the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the actual route. That's the name of the route that the slaves took from Africa into the Americas. Again, going through the Caribbean and the West Indies and then into North America. Things like tombstone ships, where they would literally line people up like this, and other cruel treatments like lack of food, leaving dead people next to the live people, tossing them overboard, horrible things, would lead to like just the terrible, horrible living conditions. It is rough. It's not easy, and it is pretty horrible, all things considered. Now, let's move on. So if you need more time on the slide, pause, just like the last two. We're going to talk about some lasting effects of slavery in the colonies. So, as slavery became the dominant labor system in the southern colonies, because again, the southern colonies will truly adapt to slavery, new laws created strict racial systems that prohibited interracial relationships. It was not okay to marry or be involved with a African person. It was it wasn't even just frowned upon, it was like illegal, it was bad, it was wrong. And this defined descendants of African American mothers as blacks and enslaved in perpetuity, meaning that if you're born and your mom was black, you were automatically black, even if you were half, white and black didn't matter, and you were automatically enslaved as a result. Some of these are primary sources here. This is from the American slave trade, which we will get into a little later. I know it says Wikipedia, but it's just an image that we took. This is an actual photograph right near the Civil War. Pretty horrible track record for the fact that there's photographs of enslaved people working in cotton fields, but there is, and we'll see more later as we get into the topic more. Just keep in mind there are lasting effects of this. Like there's a system of racial inequality that is born from slavery, and it stays there for a very long time, and you could argue you could still feel its remnants today, but it's born especially in the South through this here. So we're going to change gears. So if you need time on the slide, go ahead and pause because we're moving into the First Great Awakening. That is what we're talking about, the First Great Awakening. Let's get into it. So, key point 2, the First Great Awakening occurred from the 1710s around to the 1750s, and it was a religious movement that helped people feel more independent. What does it help people do? It helps them feel more independent. Start to think on their own. They start to be like, hey, maybe this king guy doesn't know everything. And so we're going to move on and get into that a little bit more and what it means. This is a really big topic. It's super important, and we'll talk about why going next. So a few causes before we get into this, so pause here if you need it. A few causes. This is some backlash from the Enlightenment. A major thing that caused backlash that leads to this was the Salem witch trials. Events happening have led people to question religion. So this is part of what the Salem witch trials did, right? People are like, well, maybe, the people in charge, the religious people in charge, don't have all the right answers. And remember, the First Great Awakening, right? Awakening, you can see, actually, I'm going to try to turn my camera on so you can. I'm going to add that in a bit then, because I can't seem to add it in right now, so I will add it in after, and trust me, I will do it. But know that the First Great Awakening, right, because it's an awakening, know that it was people questioning things. They're questioning religion, they're questioning leadership, but it is a religious movement at its core, and we're going to talk about two of the preachers that are at its center. All right, so if you need time on the slide, go ahead and pause, because we're moving on. First one is Jonathan Edwards. He preached fire and brimstone, which meant he was rough and he was mean, and so was God, and you were going to be punished if you didn't do what was right. He brings emotion to the people and inspires them to pick up on the idea that you can control your own ideas. You can dictate what your religious practices are, right? You don't have to listen to people telling you how to do it. Edwards is the beginning this is the beginning of challenging authority. He helps lead to that. It creates the mindset later on of this isn't right when the British start taxing the colonists and we get into taxation without representation and all that stuff. This isn't right. It's not fair. That mindset comes from a lot of the words of Jonathan Edwards. This is his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. As you can tell, very fire and brimstone preacher that he was. A fire and brimstone preacher, as they say. So, let's move on to the next guy. So if you need time on the slide, go ahead and pause. George Whitefield has a major influence from Georgia all the way up to Massachusetts. He traveled all up and down the colonies, but he's especially good in Georgia, where he helps convert natives and stuff like that. He helps people rationalize the idea of breaking away from England. He helps them realize that, maybe this ain't such a bad idea, And he spreads Christianity through this idea, whereas Edwards is all about fire, brimstone, punishment. Whitefield is more like, hey, it's important that you worship in your own way. You worship your own God. You do you. And it's something that sticks to a lot of people. Now, there is still persecution. Catholics are still going to face it, and so will Jews when they arrive. But because I don't have the actual numbers, but like 90% at least of the colonists moving to the New World are Protestants. So you're still going to see persecution just by numbers alone. But it is something that Whitefield still kind of preached. Like, hey, let people do their thing, you do yours, and that's kind of the best way to do it. Now we have two historical connections to talk about. And they're very simple and they're very straightforward. And yes, you need to write them down. Even if you wrote them down the first time, write them again. The First Great Awakening leads to the American Revolution, just like the Second Great Awakening will lead to the American Civil War. Now, I can't stress enough that these two awakenings, as I call them, are critical, just critical to the actual sum or result in these conflicts. And they mirror each other in the sense that the first is from the 1710s to the 1750s, and the second is from the 1810s to the 1850s. It is shocking how similar these events are about 100 years apart, and how similar the results will be. Major conflicts that will shape the United States for a very long time. So just keep that connection in mind. It is a big one. It is an important one. It is a good one to know. And with that being said, we're going to move on to key point 3. So, there were multiple factors that affected the colonies. Some unified the regions and others divided them. So let's get into the unifying reasons. Ben Franklin's Postal Service links the original 13 colonies together. He literally links It's in red. I need to fix that. It's in red. All right. He links all those colonies together, though. And he does so through a postal service, which is still a relatively new thing. There we go. So these 13, hopefully that looks a little cleaner. We're done. There we go. That'll work. And linked through the postal service. So Ben Franklin, who designed this postal system, links them together. So they're actually able to communicate with one another and get messages across in mail, which back then is a big deal. There's no instant communication. Another thing that unifies these people is that they're all immigrants. All of them. So they all can, in a lot of ways, see past the little differences that they have, because there's some minor little things, but it's not a big thing, and feel united in the sense that they're all immigrants that are moving to a new place. Native Americans, American Indians, will be another issue for them, because it'll be something that unifies them in the sense that it gives them all a common enemy. As bad as that may sound, as much as you may disagree with it, that is the truth of the matter. People of that time saw Native Americans as a common enemy, and it unified them against their common enemy. We've talked about it already, how natives aren't quite really, maybe probably not an enemy, but it's besides the point. The point is that's how these colonists saw it, and it unifies them. And then the English language, because all the groups, like we talked about the French people that showed up, or like the Pennsylvania Dutch and all these other groups that speak other languages, they'll all eventually adopt English, putting them together. They all speak the same language. They all can talk to each other and communicate. It's super helpful. Now, let's talk about divisive forces. So go ahead and pause there, and we're going to talk about divisive forces. Up it changed. So again, if you need this slide, the unifying, pause. Now let's talk about divisive forces. The geography. Geography was a big deal. It took a month for a rider to go from down here in Georgia all the way up to Massachusetts. It took about a month for a lone rider on a horse. If you wanted to take your family in a wagon and all that stuff, it would take even longer. On top of that, climate and disease led to trouble, especially in places like the South where mosquitoes would kill people with malaria and you'd freeze to death in the North. It just was rough. Now, another thing that divided people was class differences. Under British rule, there was a class system in place. And what that class system, the gentlemen and the ladies and the peasants, and what it basically boils down to is people from Britain are better than and higher on the system than American-born people, which is going to lead to some problems. And there's no one unifying currency. Some places are going to use Spanish currency, some places are going to use French currency, some places are going to use British currency. It is going to be all over the place, which means you have to deal with conversion rates and exchange rates, and it is going to be rough. And eventually, when we get to it, when the colonies all want to trade with each other, they're going to be arguing over how much they should tax each other. So it just leads to all sorts of problems and issues. So those are the dividing factors at play. That being said, we're going to move on to the exit ticket, which is a little bit different today. So this is not an SAQ, unlike the others have been in the past. I want you to answer something in your own words. I want you to treat it kind of like a quick write, which means I just want you to go and answer it, in your own words. Don't worry about academic format, but just put the numbers 1, 2, and answer the questions. The first one, explain the effects of the Atlantic slave trade on the colonies and explain how slavery is used in the 13 colonies. Second one, explain why the First Great Awakening. So just tell me about it. What did it do for people, and what happens after? So that is it, guys. That is it for me. If you have any questions, make sure you contact me on Teams or see me in office hours tomorrow because it's Tuesday. I won't be there. But otherwise, guys, have a great rest of your day. I'll see y'all in class at another time.